If you're listening to this show and you're interested in finance, I'd suggest to you you're putting yourself in a good position to one day have an excess emergency fund.
Do you want a wealthy retirement without worrying about money? Welcome to the Retire in Texas podcast, where you will discover how to enjoy your faith, your family, and your freedom in the state of Texas. And now, here's your host, financial advisor, author, and all-around good Texan, Daryl Lyons.
Hey, this is Daryl Lyons, CEO and co-founder of Pax Financial Group, and you're listening to Retire in Texas. Thanks for tuning in. I want to remind you that this information is general in nature only. It's not intended to provide specific tax, legal, or investment advice. Visit paxfinancialgroup.com for more information. Again, as I've reminded you guys that we have a few ebooks on our website. The one that's getting a lot of traction that a lot of people seem to like is our Biblical Responsible Investing one. We also have one on pivot retirement planning. Both of those are free. They're just resources to help guide you. Those that are clients of PAX, you're probably acclimated to a lot of those resources and the terminology and language. But for those that aren't, it's a good way to get to know us better. So there you go. Hope you get to check them out. They're free. So we're going to talk a little bit about cash. Cash is interesting because growing up, and frankly, most of my life, when you start out in the financial advisory business, it's really tough, at least the way I started out, because I didn't have a salary. And so I was just kind of knocking on doors and trying to find people who might want to do business with me. And it's just hard. It's really hard to be a financial advisor who's broke too. It's kind of like a shop teacher with no fingers. You just kind of scrap and get lucky, and people give you a break and give you a shot. And I'm very thankful to those people. I know exactly those people who gave me a shot when I didn't deserve it. But I remember during those times reading, I was always studying finance, and I remember reading about excess emergency funds. So this is a problem when somebody has too much of an emergency fund. And I couldn't help scratch my head as I was completely broke, thinking, I am just worrying about paying my energy bill, and people are worried about excess emergency funds? Really? I thought, how is that possible? My past self was thinking, I think that'll be an interesting problem, but let me just get to the point where I'm surviving. And then maybe once I survive, I can squirrel enough money away to actually have something called an emergency fund. And then maybe one day, way down the road with a lot of gray hair, I'll have something called an excess emergency fund, and I'll have to deal with that problem then, which really isn't a real problem, is it? It's a champagne problem. Here we are today, and I'm talking to somebody nearly every day about their excess emergency fund, air quote, problem. I don't discount it. I know it's something to think about, and you want to be good stewards of your money, and you don't want it to be under a mattress. And it kind of is. Even if it's in a bank account, it's still kind of under a mattress if it's not earning anything. So that's what I want to talk to you today about. I want to talk today about excess emergency fund. If you were like me years ago that didn't have emergency fund nor an excess emergency fund, still listen to this show, because I think if you're listening to this show and you're interested in finance, I'd suggest to you you're putting yourself in a good position to one day have an excess emergency fund. So here we are. So let's talk about it for just a second, and let's set the stage, because at the end of the show, I want to make sure you know where to put your excess emergency fund money. I'm going to tell you that. But I have to define emergency fund to know what excess is, logically speaking. So an emergency fund for many people that are working is going to be 6 times your monthly expenses. Now, some people get that confused with income. Don't get that confused, because those numbers are different and they could be meaningfully different. So it's 6 times your monthly expenses. If you are married and both spouses are working, you could probably be fine with 3 months. If you have an income and maybe a pension, you probably could be fine with 3 months as well. But for the majority of people who are working, we call that the accumulation stage. That's 6 months of reserve set aside in a savings account, easily accessible, 6 times your monthly expenses. Why 6 times? Like, who came up with this 6 times monthly expenses thing? Well, the idea is that most expenses aren't going to cost that much money, like a car breakdown or a refrigerator breaking or an AC in the heat of the summer. An emergency fund, as we know, turns a crisis into an inconvenience, but there is one circumstance that the crisis remains a crisis. Do you know what that is? That's a disability. And I'm not talking about falling off a ladder. That certainly does happen. Don't get me wrong. But most disability companies will tell you that their claims are neurological or anxiety or blood-related issues, disease, cancer. They're not necessarily accidents. And so if something happens to any of us, I just had a situation the other day. Somebody told me a 40-year-old had an aneurysm. They unfortunately died, but in many cases, I've had several clients that have become disabled in their early 40s. And what do you do then? Well, having a 6 months emergency fund really doesn't do you much good, but it does buy you time. It buys you time because you should have a long-term disability policy. That long-term disability policy is your lifeline to income for an extended period of time, often age 65. So having a 6 months emergency fund gives you enough runway to get through the deductibility on those policies. A lot of the long-term disability policies have a 90-day deductible period. And then you want to have more money beyond that 90-day because sometimes the claims process can take longer than 90 days as they do their due diligence, check medical records, confirm that it's legitimate. And so it could extend beyond the 90 days. And so having 6 months gives you that plenty of runway before that long-term disability policy kicks in. That's why it is recommended that you have 6 months, generally speaking, for an emergency fund. Like I said before, there's situations, 2-income households, you have a pension, 3 months is fine. Now, there's actually other organizations that we call them entities in the textbooks, I guess, that have an issue too. And I'm seeing this a lot. Churches right now, believe it or not, many churches have excess emergency funds. It's kind of interesting, maybe even a building fund. Businesses, seeing a ton of businesses that have excess emergency funds, especially those in construction, just doing really, really well. Nonprofits, for-profit, social organizations, we're seeing a lot of these institutions coming to us and saying, we've got more cash than we need. We don't know where to invest it right now because we're not finding the deals that we used to, but we want to make sure that this money's growing. Can you help us? And so you might ask the question, if you're a business of any sorts, nonprofit or for-profit, well, what constitutes an emergency fund for business? Are there any rules of thumb? There's really not, honestly. It's really circumstantial. And a lot of it depends on the reoccurring revenue of the business and government contracts and when those renewals happen. So for me, when I get the question from a business and nonprofit, how much do I need an emergency fund? I always say, I need to understand your business just a little bit better to give you a direct answer. With that being said, a lot of businesses know they've got too much. So if you got too much, you fall in the category of having excess emergency funds. If any of this resonates with you and you're like, oh man, I'm in that situation, again, champagne problems. I'm sorry. We've got a problem we've got to solve. And then you look at that money above and beyond that excess emergency fund and you ask yourself, okay, reasonably speaking, can this money be invested for 5 years or more? And if it can, then I'm going to share with you a few solutions in just a second. If it cannot be invested for 5 years or more, then you may want to consider a CD at your local bank. They're paying pretty well right now, 4-5%. So it's excess emergency funds. You get the dollar amount, and then you ask yourself, can this excess emergency fund be set aside for 5 years or more? And if it can, that's what I want to talk to you about in the next 5 minutes. Excess emergency fund has a time horizon longer than 5 years, but just in case you need liquidity still, just in case I still want to get it. So I don't want to tie it up in anything where I can't access it, but I also want to earn a little bit more on it. And then you ask yourself, well, do I want to be in the stock market? Many people in this decision-making mode, they don't want this money to be stock market money. They've got other stuff in stocks, but that they're fine with. But this excess emergency fund, I'm not sure I want this to be stock market money. Maybe a little bit, Daryl, but not a lot. Okay, so what's our choices? Well, what lands between stocks and CDs? There's one type of investment that lands between the two. Any guesses? It's bonds. Now, bond is a loan. A bond is a loan that you make to AT&T or whoever, corporation, government, entity, whatever, and you lend it to them and they promise to pay you back that money in a given time period with interest along the way every 6 months. So bonds have less risk than stocks. And I am really keeping this really simple. Maybe we'll do a different podcast on the nuances here. But generally speaking, bonds have less risk than stocks, generally speaking. But rather than buying individual bonds, which we can do that, we'll do individual bonds at PAX and other institutions will. Generally speaking, most of the time it's not done in just buying a bond. Most of the time it's looking at funds. Now, a fund, when you think about a fund, you think about not just one bond, but maybe hundreds of bonds. That way you don't just buy Enron or whatever company. You spread that risk out so you're not subject to one company risk. So you buy a fund of bonds, and that is the in-between of CDs and stocks, is bond mutual funds. Now, you can also do bond exchange-traded funds. There's just nuanced differences between the two. I think I've done some previous podcasts on those, but you can do either one. In my research, actually, I got to stop there. I want to go there a little bit. Maybe you can ping me, Daryl@paxfg.com. I wasn't prepared to necessarily talk about my research on which one's better, stocks, ETFs, or the mutual funds. Maybe I'll do that in another show. But there is some research that mutual funds can be better than exchange-traded funds. I'm going to leave that kind of dangling and come back to that at another show because that's just a really nerdy, technical, but fun analysis. But generally speaking, if you own a fund that has bonds in it, you're going to diversify any Enron risk. Then you ask yourself the question, there's like thousands of options to choose from. Which ones do I choose from? Well, it starts with asking yourself, do you want long-term bonds, short-term bonds, or something in between called intermediate bonds? And the longer the term the bond, sometimes, not always, but the longer the term the bond, the higher yield you'll get. And so working with an advisor, you can do this research on your own. Trust me, you can do it on your own. It just takes a little bit of time. But working with an advisor, a good advisor should be able to say, okay, here's a long-term bond fund, here's an intermediate-term bond fund, here's a short-term bond fund, and here's the yields on each one of them. Which one do you think makes the most sense? And let's put a combination of them together. So that's very rational. And then you've got another set of decisions to make. Do I want high yield bonds, which are higher credit risk? Used to be called junk bonds. They changed the name to high yield because nobody would buy junk. Or you can buy high quality bonds. You would expect if you're going to buy junk bonds or high yield bonds, you're going to get a better rate of return. And sometimes those returns are very attractive. So you just kind of mix and match. And so I say, how do I want to mix this recipe together in my bond strategy between intermediate, short, long, junk, and high quality? And you just kind of put the recipe together that works for you. Let it cook for 5 years and see what happens. Now, what's interesting is we can't forget that a 0.5% here or 1% there compounded over time is a significant dollar amount if there's significant excess emergency funds involved. So it's incumbent upon all of us to say, if we've got a 5-year time horizon, that we make good use of this money. It's not impossible to find solutions in today's marketplace for excess emergency funds. It's a fun conversation we're having probably once a week. The bond market is the one that's giving us an opportunity to really get that little bit of excess return that we need without taking that stock market risk. So I hope that was educational. Ping me, Daryl@paxfg.com, if you want me to dive deeper on any of this, because I kept it high level today, but I would be happy to land that helicopter and really nerd out on this stuff. You've listened to this episode of Retire in Texas. Thanks again for tuning in. And I want to remind you, as always, you think different when you think long-term. Have a great day.